Nous continuons avec le colloque de Londres de 1981 et une discussion entre Geoffrey Cornelius et John Addey. John Addey, connu pour ses harmoniques, et Geoffrey Cornelius, auteur plus récemment de The Moment of Astrology.
Yes, I see. It's very good quality. It's flexible. Very nice of you. Yes, I would suggest, of course, that one could have this discussion another time. But I mean, it's also nice to have a interview for 20 minutes now. I would just ask you a few questions about some historical points. Yeah. Just let it be. Goodbye, see you later.
Voilà, on reconnaît John Addey. C'était un congrès qui a eu lieu l'année suivante à Londres. Et moi, je suis là.
Well, we are going to make an interview about 20 minutes of John Addey on this subject.
Donc, interview par Jacques Albron et d'autres personnes de John Addey.
No, we are going to record it, and you can, to the contrary, you can work. You are welcome to listen to the interview and even to ask a few questions to John Addey. They will be recorded. So, since we don't have a lot of people, we're going to record that, and eventually there will be a discussion. Vous entendez bien ici? Vous pouvez vous rapprocher? Since we are not a lot of people, I will ask you questions which are rather technical questions. The problem, for instance, is well, let's start with a very basic question, which I don't know if you have been interested in. It's the history of English astrology in the whole.
Yes.
Yes.
I don't know what happened in
Yes, how you consider the history of English astrology?
Yes, well, I don't know very much astrology before the time of William Lee. Obviously there was a little, but it was, and I don't really know where he got his astrology from. My knowledge of English astrology is very poor. I think he translated some works, but I don't really know.
Let's see.
And then, after William Linnesy died in, I think, 1681 or thereabouts, there was quite an outburst of astrology about that time. In the late 1600s, there was a lot of astrology. Hello, Geoffrey, how nice to see you. There was a lot of astrology about then, and it was rather faded away, and then all that was left for the following 150 years was almanacs and so forth, and you know, Nick Howard has talked about those, and written a little book about it, and really it was a very circumscribed scene, wasn't it, this almanac? I mean, obviously the almanac sold very well. Old Mole's Almanac is the longest running periodical in the world, practically. When did it start, Jeffrey? Sometime in 1650 or thereabouts, I don't quite know. But it's been going for about 300 years, the Old Mole's Almanac, and that's about the longest running periodical publication in the world, or one of them of its kind anyway. And then, of course, about the turn of the last century, Alan Leo was the great influence who helped to revive more widespread influence in astrology. This section is in a very large degree the astrological lodge, who carried the torch from about 19th century 3, 4, 5, when it was first founded. When was it first founded? 1915.
Geoffrey Cornelius.
And then from that came first the faculty, and then later the Astronomical Association. I came from it that the lodge didn't take any initiative in the case of the association, but it takes some initiative in the case of the faculty. But those who were instrumental in starting both of those were very much lodge members, weren't they, Geoffrey, and had learned and sort of imbibed their mother's milk from the mouth. And that's a brief outline.
Yeah.
As far as I know.
So it's probably the way most English astrologers represent their own history of astrology.
I think it is, yes.
But I mean, well, when do you see the decline of English astrology? Well, I mean, in the 18th century. And before
Yes,
you go
I
back,
suppose so.
and what do you call it a decline? I mean, when I suppose by decline you mean when there are no more treatises, no more serious publications, apart from almanacs.
I think that's what I would say, yes. But, as I say, not an authority on this topic.
No.
When the field...
John Addey est interrogé sur l'histoire de l'astrologie anglaise.
It was very much into the popular kind of astrology, which, well, I don't think it had much depth to it.
And when did you see the revival?
Oh, I think with Alan Leo.
Oh, you don't see it. Well, but I'm afraid that before Alan Leo, there was the revival started about 200 years before Alan Leo. Well, for example, you have the first of all, you have the people like Zadkiel, Raphael,
yes, but
Pierce,
they were very much almost
Simonides. But they are published. Actually, I just bought yesterday the textbook of Pierce in astrology.
Yes, right,
I mean, they were rather considerable works.
They were, yes, it's quite true, yes. I handed my copy of Pierce over to the association yesterday.
It's a reprint, yes.
Yes, quite. What were Pierce's dates then?
Oh, it's about 1850.
Yeah.
And Zadkiel publication of Zadkiel work is the middle of the 19th century, and Raphael is even earlier than that. And then you have also someone at the end of the 18th century like Ebenezer Sibley.
Can you call this a revival? Isn't this a continuation of a very, very small tradition?
Yes, that's a question. Yes, that's what I said. What are the criteria of a revival? Is it a problem of popular interest, or is it a problem of lack of publications?
These are individuals as well, they weren't they? Before the 20th century, they were individuals, but there wasn't much following.
Political communication between There's a very different note that enters astrology, it seems, around the time of Leo, and I'm very fascinated to know how far that's directly his personal influence. We seem to get a terminology or way of talking about astrology that's quite different to the way of talking about astrology before Leo. Esoteric terms that come from theosophy and an understanding of Buddhism seems to make like karma becomes used as a word in astrology for the first time with Leo.
Yeah, that's right. However, the basis of modern astrology, that is, for instance, the attribution of Uranus and Neptune to certain signs, the problem of, the usage precisely, the usage of Uranus and Neptune in the first textbooks, the decision to integrate these new planets, has been decided in the 19th century. I mean, very quite vital decisions about the future of astrology, of modern astrology, seem to have been taken in the 19th century, a long time before Alain Leo.
But there is an attempt to bring astrology up to date by incorporating the newly discovered factors?
Yes, but this attempt is anterior, is earlier than Leo's.
Yes, but that does that qualify as a revival? Here are your criteria of revival.
That's also, yes. The question is, what is a revival? Yeah. What is a revival?
Surely the enormous public impact of the work of Alan Leo and modern astrology, the test horoscopes of Alan Leo, transformed astrology in this country and probably the United States at the turn of the century. The issuing of test horoscopes by the thousands.
Yes.
The publication of the magazine Modern Astrology, which as I understand it was in some ways the first of its kind.
Yes, but what about almanacs? You said that there were a continuation of publication of almanacs. These almanacs were partly astrological, and they did touch quite a lot of people. So from this point of view, sort of popular literature has been continuously given in England. I mean,
yes, I think England has the longest continuous history of astrological activity of any country, certainly on the continent, probably in the world, except India and some of the eastern countries. Certainly a European country.
You mean since the 16th century?
Well, I mean, yes, at least since then.
Of course, before.
Yes, quite. But I don't think that the almanacs were particularly enlightening beyond the kind of superstitious interest in what was going to happen in the next year and what it was going to be like.
But don't you think that if someone like Pierce or someone like writes a treatise on astrology, it's because people are supposed to learn astrology through this book. These books are books for education.
Yes, they are.
They're not just books. Not just almanacs or articles ready-made astrology. So they're supposed to be read by people who want to learn astrology.
Yes,
so we still are in the same climate as with Leo's.
This is where my lack of knowledge about that aspect of it. I've never specialised in the study of what the kind of interest was in the person who has specialised, like Eric Howard, hasn't given me the impression that there's a lot of interest.
Well, Eric Howard does make a certain research on 19th century astrology in England, and well, I must say that I do not agree with the idea that revival begins with Leo in England. Not from the point of view of popular astrology, since there were the almanacs during the whole 19th century, Raphael's almanac, and not from the point of view of teaching astrology to a certain number of people who just want to learn astrology seriously, since there were a certain number of textbooks which were to be read by students of astrology.
I'd like to ask you though, Jacques, considering the tradition in Britain and the United States, I can't speak for the other European countries, if we look at the textbooks now written on astrology, aren't they very close in spirit and style in the actual interpretations given to factors in the way of writing to Alan Leo? Isn't there a very distinct difference when you pick up the work of earlier writers, that even their technical approach is different? The great disputes about primary directions, the use of primaries for a start was beginning to fade as a popular astrological technique around the turn of the century. You're getting a making accessible of astrology to a reasonably intelligent person instead of somebody who's going to be a mathematician. So the serious astrologers before Leo would be quite heavyweight characters who would be considerable technical command. And then there would be the popularisers, the almanac writers. But surely Alan Leo brings us a sort of astrology that we have today, where a reasonably intelligent person can be making a go at their astrology quite quickly and reading horoscopes.
I am ready to bring the book by Pierce on astrology, if you don't mind. So you will see how difficult this book is for a normal student. Well, because your question is very pertinent. I mean, but it's I would say it needs a study of the text. I mean, study of the structure of the textbook and see what level is needed to. It is obvious that from the point of view of the ephemeris, from the point of view of using instruments, you know, like, well, it is certain that, and that is the point, of course, that the fact that it's more easy. I mean, the development of the ephemeris, like American ephemeris and like that, of course, makes the task of the astrologer easier. And that is a matter, of course, that probably in the 19th century the student of astrology had more work to do, because you might not have always these ephemeris. Well, although ephemeris were already published, I think, at least in France in the 1850s. So if you want, we could, well, I mean, we could compare. I'm ready to bring Pierce's textbook of astrology. Your argument is this sort of textbook did concern a rather evolved class of people who needed to have a certain scientific background to become astrologers, and with Leo, this level, these conditions are are minimal.
I don't put that upon Leo, but things change
from his point of view.
By 1920 or 30, become a very different style of astrology, and primary directions are beginning to fade from view, aren't they, by the Second World War?
Yeah.
Very few astrologers now seem to practice them. But that's merely a technical detail. I'd still put to you that the dissemination of astrology that Alan Leo was responsible for, and friends of his at that time, that was occurring largely in England, transformed astrology and introduced it to a very wide sector of the population. Just that work of disseminating astrology. So one might not discern any great difference in techniques, but I think there are some. Just the dissemination of astrology will alter it.
Well, it may be the development of press. I mean, it's also a character of the 20th century that information is widely dispersed, and that, of course, people. I mean, anything gets bigger in the 20th century. So it might be just an example of interest of the audience for larger problems. I mean, the press is developing, for instance, the feminine press, basically, which has seemed to have played an important role. Well, anyway, in France, if you just want to compare with France, in France the idea of revival is a lot clearer than in England.
Is it?
Yes. And maybe it would help us.
Where did it take place in France?
Yes, in France, it really did take place at the end of the 19th century. But comparatively to what happens in England, precisely, comparatively, there was not such a break in England like in France, in the tradition. You know. Well, it's, for instance, if we take the books which, during the 19th century, you can find a certain number of books in England which react to the discovery of Uranus, for instance. Which, because of the question we had this afternoon, for instance, when did astrologers start to show any interest in Uranus, which was discovered in 1781? They certainly didn't wait until Alan Leo to show any interest in that. You can see in books of 1815, 1820, already a discussion about the usage of Uranus. And the English astrologer have been probably the only one who have led the idea who have led the research on new planets. While in France, it's nearly impossible to find any allusion to Uranus in astronomical textbooks before 1880. That's just a point.
Wary of regarding discussion about a factor like Uranus as being a mark of revival. It doesn't necessarily. It depends once again on the criteria for revival, because I'd like to move to what I think is a very fundamental point that we've perhaps not discussed before. The attitude to interpretation of a horoscope, I think, alters in this country perhaps I cannot speak for other places in Europe, but the example I'll give you is that if you look at the 19th century textbooks written in English, there's a tendency for them to be aphoristic. The astrology practice is an aphoristic astrology, sets of rules. Alan Leo made the remark that 19th century astrologers seemed to have confused horary with natal. He was concerned that one should separate out natal interpretation and practice the art of synthesis, so he called one of his books The Art of Synthesis. Now I think one would be very hard pushed to find early 19th century astrologers who have a concept of the synthesis of the natal horoscope. They will speak in terms of particular sects of atheism, some of them quite rational. It's a very different attitude to astrology, and it's out of that a modern psychological approach has developed.
It's a good point, but that we should, of course, relate all these analyses to a study of the text themselves, you see, to show if it is true. I mean, it's feasible. I mean, just we should compare books and text. Pardon?
What little knowledge I have of 19th century books, it seems true. So I'd be fascinated to see if you could come up with an early 19th century book that did have
I'm going to bring one book, but I'm ready to bring one book just to show. But just to return to the idea of revival before passing to some practical point on that. After all, the history of astrology might very well follow a certain number of steps. Revival is a very strong word. It doesn't just mean even revolution. Revival is stronger than revolution. Revival, revolution means that there is a certain current which is working a certain way, and at a certain time one decides to change the way of seeing this problem or living this. I mean, revolution, well, for instance, you say, well, we pass from a certain conception of the interpretation of the chart to another conception of the interpretation of the chart. That might be, at most, a revolution. Okay? But a revival, that might be a very important revolution, like they are in different other fields, At a certain, it's just a fact that in a certain field, which is living, where there is a certain activity, suddenly a certain way of looking at things is modified. That's a revolution. Revival means, as far as I understand the word, vival is life. Yeah, right. Revival. Revival comes from French word vival, vitality. Revival means something which lives again. Right.
Yes, yes.
It's a very strong word, which really means that's something which was nearly completely dead, which were completely decadent, and which had nearly stopped to live, to develop, and suddenly lives again. And it doesn't even, it is a very different word as a revolution. It might be a very unrevolutionistic revival, because here it's not even the point of changing the past. It's a point of just keeping the past. It's just a revival. For instance, if you are very sick or nearly dead, to revive means you are going to go on. I mean, it doesn't mean any revolution. It doesn't mean you are going to be another man. It just means you are just going to revive. And for astrology, to revive means just that there was a certain current, there was a certain interest. There was a certain interest, for instance, in writing books, in publishing books on a certain subject, which are nearly completely stopped, and suddenly there is a revival. But this revival might very well be, as the revival is also synonymous of renaissance in a certain way, rebirth. It's not exactly the same, but it has something to do with rebirth, revival. Rebirth means also a rediscovery of something which has been forgotten. While revolution means that you are in a certain situation, there is a certain development of things, and suddenly you decide to modify this development of things. So these two concepts of revival or renaissance on one hand, and revolution, reform, are very different concepts. One concerns revolution and reform concern the formulation of the knowledge, while revival and renaissance concern the idea of a rebirth of interest for the subject, without considering the problem of changing the ways, changing your approach. Just the fact that you get another contact which had been cut with a certain body of knowledge. You know?
Well, can I suggest that at least in English-speaking astrology there was both a revival and a revolution simultaneously at about that period?
You think there was a revolution as well as a revival?
I return with
There was more of a revival than a revolution.
Yes, more of a revival than a revolution.
Yes.
Although there's something happening to the style of astrology, it seems to me that in a way is revolutionary, but I'm not certain I would perhaps agree. I'll settle for revival.
I should think that, yes, the theosophical element provided anything that there was in the way of a change, didn't it? Don't you think so?
Yes, I suppose it did.
But it wasn't very revolutionary in the sense that it upset any apple carts exactly.
No, I suppose.
It certainly brought the kind of changes you were speaking about. That Leo did have a more of a sense of the importance of synthesizing the facts of the chart and so forth. But it was a rather gentle thing so far as any revolutionary element, but it was a revival, without a doubt, I think. And I think that he was the man that did it, Jimmy, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
As I say, I'm not an authority on the historical side. I'm very much a forward-looking astrologer, I'm not a backward-looking astrologer.
Yes, of course.
And therefore, I'm not very interested. I mean, I gave somebody a copy of a first edition of Gadbury's writings yesterday, and 24 hours later they were telling what exciting things there were. I'd never looked at it.
Do you know Mr. Canavan?
No.
Clive Cavan is just preparing a publication of John Gadbury's horary astrology.
Well,
it's not the same.
I'm not very interested in that, I'm afraid. I'm forward-looking rather than backward-looking.
No, but I mean, we started just on this field, but we are going to pass to another.
I think we're probably agreed in terms of your very strict definition of terms that it's revival that we're talking about rather than revolution. I'm prepared to agree that at least in English astrology we're talking about revival rather than revolution in terms of the century.
Well, let us take a little with Alain Leo, for instance. Alain Leo has been very influential, and as I told you once, he has been very important for France also. You might not know that, but a lot of his works have been translated into French, and so that the name like of Green or Barley or Leo, I mean, he was a very organized man. I mean, there was some very small pocket books which were translated into French, and everybody could read this book. Actually, these books appeared in France in the beginning of the 20th century, but there were already in the end of the 19th century a certain number of books which were probably more ambitious, you know, which was the revival in a certain way of French astrology. I think, but what is very curious is a book like Light of Egypt. I don't know if you know The Light of Egypt by Burgoyne or something.
Yes.
This book, which is book which was anonymously signed, has been incredibly important for the development, for the revival of French astrology. Very curious thing. And Alain Leo, well, for many people, of course, he is probably, even the idea of the new planets is not coming from Alain Leo in France. I mean, it was also developed earlier by people like this Light of Egypt. They were already introducing the idea of. But what is really bizarre in this? In fact, all the discussion, all the central discussions about how to use Uranus, how to use Neptune in the charts, all these discussions had already more or less been settled before Alain Leo, and there was already a certain consensus of what is the Uranian person, what isn't. All this, one has to understand, and Alain Leo is a little, like we say in French, the tree which hides the forest. I mean, in fact, he is like a little like a modern Ptolemy. is synthesizing a lot of works which have been done by all the English writers before him, and for instance, when he describes the Uranian or the Aquarian, because he also introduces the idea of the Aquarian age, all this has been already introduced before him by different astrologers, and what I wanted to say is they were not individual, or they were not isolated. They were really discussing. In the whole 19th century, there was debates between astrologers about precisely shall we or shan't we use Uranus in astrology, or what is the sign of Uranus, and what. I mean, all this discussion. There was a certain intellectual and collective life on astrology in the 19th century. I can prove it.
Jacques, I would still feel, Jacques, that you're limiting the criteria to one very particular level, which is, in a sense, a fairly technical one, like the issue of whether or not Uranus is interpreted. I know you will say it's fundamental, but I'd ask you, can you go to any 19th century text on astrology that discusses at length the issue of fate and free will and the ethical status of the astrologer? I think that it's with Alain Leo that these considerations really emerged centrally in astrology. Alain Leo made a statement that he said that he was concerned that few astrologers realised that the real importance of astrology was religious and philosophical. And most astrologers, of course, think that it's a matter of a technical means to a certain end of getting a predicted result. Alain Leo is very rare in that quality of bringing a philosophical discussion to astrology. I do not see that level of discussion before Leo. And astrology since Leo has been very much coloured by taking into account these stances.
In the 17th century, English astrologers were. I am sure that you can find this sort of preoccupation and this sort of dimension in 17th century English astrology. In the 17th century, well, you cannot. The problem of fate, for instance, is a problem which has been treated, I would say, throughout all this of astrology, and it has been a constant problem of discussion between astrologers, opponents of astrology. I mean, the philosophical problem is really a very old problem in discussions about astrology, and for instance, all the criticisms, all the attacks against astrology, all the apologies about astrology are touching this problem. I mean, it's by no means a new problem. It is a central issue in the 16th, 17th century between the different parties. I mean, about astrology. I'm sure that, for instance, someone like Christopher Aden is mentioning the problem. Or I mean, if we just look at the 17th century astrology, where certain authors are attacked by others, which are. It's a central issue in the 17th century.
I see some of those things are almost a political necessity for astrologers to survive in very difficult times. They have to answer the attacks of politically motivated or otherwise motivated churchmen. And some of the defences of the 17th century have a very political quality to them. And that's not to deny the importance of the philosophical arguments, but of the English astrologers of the 17th century and before, I don't consider any of them are philosophical astrologers.
Because probably...
practical astrologers who will have to know a few arguments to use against churchmen. Now, I'd suggest to you that there is no real philosophy of astrology other than a completely borrowed second-hand philosophy from earlier times until Alain Leo and what I would call the revival of the turn of the century.
It is because probably the books which are familiar to you from this period, and it are the books. I mean, well, it's very simple. According to what criterion has one developed as one tried to publish or published what was written in the 17th century on astrology. Precisely the idea that you have of the 17th century is an idea which has been well, for instance, I want to say that the idea about the English 17th century has been created by the astrologers of the 20th century in a certain way. So that in fact they have selected only the works of the 17th century which was as practical as possible, and they are the ones, according to me, who have eliminated all the works and all the developments which were not connected with practical astrology. In other words, a basic work like the Christian astrology of William Lilly has been put forward just because it appeared as a very practical textbook, you know, and they probably consider as boring works which would have dedicated hundreds of pages to the problem of fate and astrology, you see. So I think it's a certain selection of writings which has been done by people like Zadkiel, like people, you know, because I have exactly the opposite feeling. I have the impression that in the 20th century astrology has appeared more and more as a technique that you have to learn without any, apart from England and apart from the Theosophical Society, where a certain accent has been given to metaphysics, and in most countries of Europe, the revival of modern astrology, the revival of astrology, is a technical revival. The basic idea is mainly to present astrology as a technique that you have to learn without considering the religious or the philosophical impact. It's a sort of neutral astrology which doesn't interfere with any type of creed, you see.
I think both Geoffrey and I are keenly interested in the philosophical side, but it's true, I think, that astrology very largely is presented, for example, by the faculty, as something you have to learn to manage your chart and so forth, and interpret a chart. But I think that it has always been the case that those who are interested in the philosophical side are going to be much fewer in number, because everybody's interested in interpreting a chart and saying, you know, when am I going to get married or whatever. and those who are interested in the more philosophical aspects of the subject are fewer in number. That's just the way it goes. But I don't know. I mean, as I say, I'm handicapped because I don't really know the literature, and I don't know if there were any works in the 17th century English astrology which dealt at length with the philosophical side in any depth.
But in that case, they really haven't become part of a living tradition of
No,
astrology, have
no,
they?
no. But you know, that's a general fact that astrologers have a very poor knowledge of their own history.
Yes. Yes.
French astrologers have a very poor knowledge of what happened in France in the 17th century. You have William Lilly, we have Morinus.
Yes.
And that's more or less what anybody knows about 17th century astrology, you know, and that's very little, you know. And you know,
Well, let's face it, there wasn't a great depth to astrology in the last 300 years. I wouldn't say really.
300 years means 1680 to 1980.
And indeed before that, there wasn't any. It wasn't a subject of great philosophical interest to the philosophers of the time. I don't think so.
Yes, I'm sure I agree with that, and hence the revival, as we put it, depends upon the subject being able to appear of power to a philosopher, of interest to people who think just beyond a merely technical interest in their astrology. That's what the revival might depend on. The intellectual respectability of astrology might depend upon it appealing to a philosophical level, not simply to sophisticated technique.
Yes, I'm sure you're right there. Until astrology can present itself as a thoroughly rational thing right down to its roots, which it is, it's not going to attract the interests of the leaders of thought. That's what it amounts to. And I don't think this is primarily a scientific thing. Some people sometimes say that John Addey is trying to present astrology as a kind of scientific, in terms of scientific respectability. That isn't really my interest. My interest is basically a philosophical one. The scientific element was a kind of sidekick. But until you can show that astrology has a profound meaning to the whole background of thought in that period, people are not really going to take to it. And that's why I think that you must present, ideally, the two things side by side. You can present the practical, you can present the scientific approach, but you must present the philosophical as well. And I think this is very important for the future.
Yes, I do agree, and I'd like just to reaffirm the point that John was making about the what I think would be a lack of depth in the last 300 years. I know it sounds terribly sweeping, but do we not see that in the 17th century, it was about the last century, where scholars would have a world view which was harmonious with astrology, where a scholar like Ashmole can easily have a knowledge of astrology. Whereas after the 17th century, it's not easy for a scholar also to imbibe a knowledge of astrology.
That's why I mentioned the 17th century as being a century where...
and so that is why there was perhaps necessarily a collapse of a real depth of astrology in several hundred years.
Have you ever come across, have you looked at all at this enormous work called History of Magic and Experimental Science by
Thorndike,
yes.
I haven't studied it, I want to study it.
Yes, it's a basic work,
certainly.
I've got it on my shelves. The thing is, I'm not a great reader. I've read quite a lot, but it does give you the sense of where the action really is, of where people were really thinking about the deep issues that are involved in astrology.
Right.
But the question is, does this message of Alan Leo has been received if we speak retrospectively? Because, well, for instance, there is at the beginning of the 19th century, the 20th century, people like Alan Leo or people like Max Endel have decided to introduce in the historical studies, in their teachings in astrology, they decided to introduce a certain body of philosophical knowledge. That's why, for instance, the Max Endel Rosicrucians, which I happen to know well because they are quite developed in France, actually they came yesterday to give a lecture. When they teach astrology, they always present also a course on philosophy and things like that. Right? But so let us admit that it is more or less what you do also at the Astrological Society. I don't know. Well,
We wish that we could or did.
I mean, if what you say is correct, I mean, yeah. But even if you do so, and even if Max Endel followers do so, they still appear as a minority among all the students of astrology.
Yes.
That's a fact. So if it is a revival, if it has been a revival, well, we was discussing around this idea of revival. To say that the revival of astrology was precisely the introduction, for instance, of a certain philosophical insight in the astrological studies, I would say that this revival has been in fact, it cannot be identified with the incredible activity that we have in astrology today, because it has become a very minority current. I mean, it's quite marginal. It's a fringe of astrologers who care to learn astrology and a certain philosophical background at the same time. So you cannot really identify revival of astrology by no means with precisely this sort of combination of philosophy and astrology. Because
I don't exactly know, Jacques. You see, if you look around the world today, you see that all the workshops are filled with a great deal of literature, which is a revival of past publications from older times, which has a very strong mystical flavour. There really is a revival of interest in mystical and philosophical thought generally.
Yes.
And a person who goes into a shop and buys a paperback dealing with some philosophical issue, or Eastern thought, or the Sutra of the something lotus, he's very likely to come out and to start talking astrology with somebody, even though he may not himself have ever studied it very much. It's all part of a kind of movement of thought, isn't it, towards a more universal point of view about life, and an attempt to get past the tendency that science has had in the past few years to split everything up. There's a movement towards unity again, isn't there? And although most astrologers perhaps don't think specifically in terms of philosophical terms, nevertheless they've got this background to their thought that they are searching for a more unific point of view. Charles Carter really has been the person who's made a huge difference to English astrology in this century. We haven't mentioned him, but although he wasn't really a philosophical astrologer in the sense that he wrote much about the philosophy of astrology, in point of fact he was always speaking and writing about practical astrology from a philosophical point of view. It's always there behind his writing, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
He obviously has some works like the Zodiac and the Soul, which are specifically philosophical.
What about yourself? Did you develop this philosophical side?
My starting point has always been the viewpoint of mystical philosophy, and it is today, and it's always been, and I think it always will be. I shall get back to it in the end. The work that people associate with me so much is a kind of diversion to get at something else, really. But my viewpoint was always the viewpoint of mystical philosophy. What I'm really interested in, you might say, is what is the cause of an astrological effect. I hardly calculate a horoscope from one year's end to another. My approach is quite different. Sure, people will hold that against me if they knew, but my interest is very much philosophical. And I think Geoffrey rather leans in the same direction. I think we probably have slightly different viewpoints, but there's always a living hope that we may get closer together and we understand each other better.
So we do have many disagreements, but nevertheless, I think what underlies an understanding that we both have and that we share with Alan Leo and that Charles Carter has expressed is that the real importance of astrology is something of its philosophical or spiritual nature, that it is a religious or spiritual teaching in some way, and I do think that does colour a lot of the English astrology.
Yes, it does. It does.
And the other
comparatively, it does.
And the other important thing is that if astrology is to make any impact on the worldview that people hold, or rather are moving back to again, I think it has got to clarify its thinking about philosophical issues.
The point that there should be a sort of marriage. What about the solution which have been proposed? For instance, do you agree about this marriage between astrology and theosophy, for instance? Because it is good to say that there is a need for a certain philosophy, for a certain larger background, but of course you are not probably ready to accept any sort of philosophy backing into astrology.
Well, there is a universal tradition, isn't there? Theosophy is a branch from a tree. I don't know if Geoffrey would agree with this, but it seems to me that theosophy is a branch of that universal tradition of which astrology has always been a part. Aldous Huxley has a book called The Perennial Philosophy, and this perennial philosophy, in its essence, is the philosophy of which astrology is a part. It embraces the heavens and the ideas about the whole cosmos and about man's relation to the cosmos. fragmentary presentations of that universal tradition. And it is natural and symptomatic that with the 20th century there has been this revival in a more universal viewpoint about man and the cosmos and God, and that at the same time there has been a revival of astrology. I don't think we need attribute the revival, in a sense, to any particular person like Adam Leo, that he was now an important instrument. But it's like I was saying earlier in the afternoon, you come to the 18th century and suddenly everything is square. The furniture is square, the dresses are square, religion is square, politics is square, everything has a certain sort of quality about it, and nobody actually caused it. There was no one person, it just suddenly came together because this was the spirit of the times, and this was the movement that was in which humanity was involved at that time. So that, in my view, the revival of astrology this century is leading up to a much more universal viewpoint about the nature of God, the cosmos, and man, and will set science and philosophy in an altogether more universal framework than they have been in the past several hundred years.
I will ask you two questions about that. First of all, do you think that there is any need to believe in reincarnation to understand the chart? And secondly, do you think that what happens when the astrologers is reading the chart has something to do with a sort of mysterious dimension?
Well, I answered this question. Geoffrey was asked first. He may have a slightly different. In the first point, I think we might possibly both agree that you don't have to believe in reincarnation to interpret the chart, and we probably both would think that it would make sense. As to the other thing, that you need to have a kind of sixth sense. You want to know what kind of a sixth sense it is. Obviously, intuition and reason are really very close together. I'm speaking about true intuition and true reason. They're very close together, and the astrologer will always call upon those. But I don't think that is wise to call upon what I would call psychic sensitivity, the same kind of thing that you would use in reading, say, a teacup or using a pendulum or something of that kind. That, I think, is something different. And I don't think the astrologer, I mean, he may naturally have powers about that, but I don't think that is part of astrology. What do you think about that?
Yes, this is a very difficult one, John. It raises hosts of philosophical issues here. But I, in answer to your question on the second part about the use of sixth sense, I think it can be very destructive of astrology to try to move in that direction, to rely upon some sort of psychic or clairvoyant faculty, because astrology is a supremely rational art.
It is.
Now, in saying that, I'd probably take a rather different line to John on this, in that whether that implies that the universe itself is ultimately ordered in that way is another philosophical question, but astrology does completely involve the intellect, as well as all the other powers of the body, but it cannot be. True astrology, I think, always does have this mark of intellectual clarity. And so I think I do not like to see an understanding that astrology has a mystical element, which is often associated with things that I say, doesn't mean that it is then intellectually weak and loose, so that any intuition goes that cannot be supported by a reasonable statement. So although I think that astrology does have a profound mystical and even irrational component in it, it is the task of the astrologer to use the full faculties of his intellect in his art. And it is communicable in a rational way to other people.
You haven't said anything, my friend. Have you any ideas on that particular subject?
I would agree with you. I would not an authority to what it is. Just a feeling I have. That an astrologer shouldn't leave anything aside, but shouldn't either go only one way, psychic or something. If astrology can be made into doesn't exclude intuition.
Yeah.
It's as you say, it's certainly a trait of English astrology because, for example, France there is a lot of difference between French and English astrology in their history and in their attitude.
Do you know how Nostradamus got his effects? I mean,
No.
was he using astrology or not?
No, that remains a mystery for me. Mr. Meier is a specialist of Nostradamus, so we might ask him
Yes.
if you want just to.
Do you think Nostradamus was really an astrologer or was he a clairvoyant?
War ein Astrologer oder ein Voyant? Der Prophet.
Les deux.
Both.
En fait.
Ernst Meier de Zurich.
Monsieur
Voilà, c'est Nostradamus.
This way. The basic is astrology, astronomy. Half the underground basic. And has a voice in the flood, or in the crystal,
Yes.
or in the water,
Yes.
on the house stuff, and by going to lands, and half the
Yes.
and after. The name is formed as cyclus, astrological cyclus, and it's very interesting. In this time was Kepler not, Kepler should have Mars. No.
The time of
Then
Nostradamus
then it is noise over Mars. It's after. All this calculation and Nostradamus are right and connection with the Mars. Right in this time.
That's lovely, yes.
The name before Kepler.
Actually, yes, really, yes.
Yes, you mentioned Nostradamus, of course, because he is a Frenchman of the 16th century. But, what is for example, the first time I came to England to attend astrological conferences, I was very surprised by the use of words like karmically or things like that, because we have been completely evacuated from French astrology.
Hello.
Yes. We are really, well, the French astrology has been developed finally in refusing any alliance with theosophy or with divinatory art, something like that. It's a sort of, well, it's based probably on the strategy that this sort of alliance is compromising for astrology.
Yes.
So in fact, you will never hear in any discussion in France, in a historical meeting, any reference to theosophy or something like that. And actually, the Theosophical Society has never developed an important branch of astrology in France since the last 50 years.
So what then do you base, what is French astrology, how is it sort of orientated in those terms? Is it towards the scientific side or towards the philosophical side?
It's much towards the scientific side or the pseudo-scientific side.
Yes, Paul Schwarzenegger would be an important figure.
Yeah, he's probably a predecessor of Gauquelin, yeah. And he has built what we call this scientific astrology, and his first books appeared at the beginning of the century. And so it was the first, probably you must not forget that the first attempts to base astrology on statistics have been developed in France with people like Paul Schwarzenegger, you know. And there's no doubt about that. And it has been more or less banished. This sort of language, philosophical language, has been more or less radically banished from the historical circles.
It's possible, from what little I know, Jacques, that French astrology may be changing in the sense that my contact should be very favourable
in the future.
With Denis Labouré.
Yeah.
Denis stands for, he has a deeply Christian orientation that I feel doesn't compromise his practical or the craft of astrology one bit, and yet he sees astrology as fundamentally initiatic, he said to me.
We might have a revival, as you say, but this revival will come only now. I mean, if you, well, I don't really accept the idea of revival as being connected with a philosophical interest, but we must say that there is, for the last 10 years maybe, there is a certain revival or development of a sort of spiritual astrology. But it remains, these people are more and more numerous, but they still remain as sort of pariahs. They are not really taken seriously. You cannot speak in an astrological meeting and develop a certain number of considerations on philosophy without provoking a certain number of negative reactions.
Yes.
You are not taken seriously if you develop it. For the same reason, our astrology is not very popular in France. You know? So in fact, we are rather protection. Well, a lot of fear actually. A lot of important theories like harmonics or German astrology have little penetrated into France, actually.
But one would have thought harmonics above all would appeal to that attitude, which is seeking some approach with science. I mean, this is a very concern. I would have thought that or are you equating it with a philosophical standpoint?
I don't know why the harmonics. Well, that's a good question.
Nobody has translated.
That's a good question.
That's what it is. Yeah.
Would the harmonics be favorably considered in France or not? If they were, of course, offered to the French audience.
It would enable the integration of Geoffrey amongst his own countrymen. I would have thought.
Yeah.